Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for tuning in this evening for our online Bible study. Let's get into it. I welcome you. And if you are new to the church or new to this study, my name is Dave St. Aubin. I'm the senior pastor here at Thoburn United Methodist Church. It's a joy and a blessing to be with you here this evening as we kick off a new week of study tonight. We will be looking at Leviticus chapter 11. So I invite you to grab your Bibles, open up to Leviticus 11, grab something to take some notes with, and let's get into it. Well, again, good evening and welcome. So glad you're able to be here this evening. I pray and hope that you had a wonderful weekend and pray that your day's been going well today also. We start a new week of study. We start a new journey here in the book of Leviticus. And we've been in this book for the last 10 chapters, the last 10 days or so. And just to kind of recap where we were at on Friday, we looked at Leviticus 10 and the deaths of Aaron's two oldest sons. We've been in this narrative of the law, so to speak, over the last few chapters. Tonight, as we continue through the book of Leviticus, we're going to look at chapter 11 and the beginning of this discussion, which will take us through this week, of the laws that related to ritual cleanliness. And what we're going to talk about here tonight will take us through Friday, through Leviticus chapter 15. And so there's a lot to talk about this evening, a lot to talk about this week. Some of these chapters are much longer than others that we've been in. As people continue to come into our virtual classroom here, I just want to take a moment to go to God in prayer together, and then we will dive into this chapter. So let's take a moment to pray and give thanks. And God, we do thank you for a new week of study. We thank you for this opportunity to just slow down for a little bit in the middle of our busy days, to be still, to hear your word, to study your word, and to understand what your word speaks to us today, not just as a historical text that is thousands of years old, but that your word is alive and that it speaks to us today. And so, God, I thank you for this time. I pray for everybody who's tuning in right now live or at another time. Be with us as we journey together here and study your word, reveal something new to us, and let this be a positive, uplifting time of study. So, God, we thank you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, friends, again, a lot to talk about here. And so as we start with chapter 11, we are seeing a shift in the narrative. So now we are going back to a legislation kind of narrative. And the structure of Exodus 14 all the way through Leviticus 25 is it's after each failure of the Israelites, God gave them more laws. So starting with Exodus 14, and we saw the complaining of the Israelites after they left Egypt and went into Sinai. And after that, we saw the laws of the Mosaic covenant. Then we saw the golden calf incident. That was in Exodus chapter 32. And what that led to was the priestly code, the tabernacle, everything that we talked about the tabernacle. That took us from Exodus 33 all the way through Leviticus chapter 9. And then we saw Friday this incident with the death of Aaron's two oldest sons, Abihu and Nadab. And the result of that now is going to be more priestly code, more regulations. And so, whereas Leviticus chapters 1 through 10 focused on the sanctuary, now we are coming into this realm, this sphere, so to speak, of Israel's everyday life with all of its possibilities of defilement. And so it's made clear here that in Israel everything was placed under religious light, and that the Lord's instruction, with all of its regulations that pertain to what could be done or what could not be done or what could not be handled or tasted or touched, that there's no other aim here than the sanctification of the life of every Israelite. Remember, I had mentioned when we started Leviticus, this is a book about holiness and sin, right? A holy God and sinful people. And so now chapters 11 through 15 that we're going to look at this week, they pick up this idea introduced on Friday in Leviticus 10, verse 10, to make a distinction between the holy and the profane, between the clean and the unclean. So this section that we're going to talk about all week is going to culminate in next Monday, chapter 16, and the cleansing of the nation on the Day of Atonement. And these chapters, they're going to teach us that God's people must be a clean people, both inwardly and outwardly. There must be physical cleanliness on the exterior, but there also must be this ceremonial cleansing from that which defiles us spiritually and morally in the eyes of God. We are to be both sanitarially clean and sacrificially cleansed. And so these chapters this week that we're going to look at on purity are going to help explain it for the Israelites what uncleanness meant. It's going to teach how the holiness of God requires both cleansing and this continual purification from the contaminations of life. The word that's going to be used here in Hebrew for clean or cleaning means it's tahor. It means ritual purity. It means not just hygienic clean, but being ritually cleansed from everything that is defilement. And there seems to be a rationale behind the order of these laws, and it's based on the length of time for uncleanness. So tonight, chapter 11, we're going to see what God says about the violation of dietary laws. And when that happens, it results in uncleanness for hours. Tomorrow, when we look at the uncleanness that comes from childbirth in chapter 12, that would leave the woman unclean for months. Chapters 13 and 14, talking about skin and clothing and the uncleanness of that, could mean uncleanness for years. And then Friday, when we look at chapter 15, we'll talk about these regulations around bodily discharges resulting in being unclean for hours, weeks, or years. So there's a pattern here. So let's start with chapter 11. I just want to give you a little background here, and we'll get into the verses. Take good notes here. Stay with me. This is a lot of information, but we'll talk through it. And if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, and I'll get back to you on those as soon as I can. If you're on Facebook or YouTube, put them in the chat, and then others can see their responses as well. So chapter 11 looks at uncleanness due to contact with certain animals. So this chapter contains a selected list of various creatures and divides each type of creature into various classes of purity. And the goal here was to determine whether an animal could be touched or not touched, eaten or not eaten. And this notion of uncleanness or cleanness is it's particularly applied here in this chapter to the question of holiness and violating any of these regulations that we're going to see that relate to clean and unclean animals. Any violation of these regulations would render somebody unclean, right? Defiled, uncommon, or profane, and thus unable to enter into this community of worship. And we'll see that tomorrow. So, the purpose of this chapter is to tie the concept of God's holiness and God's own example of holiness into the lives of the Israelites. And there were three different kinds of animals talked about in Leviticus. Unclean animals that could not be eaten, clean animals that could be eaten, and clean animals that could be eaten and also served as sacrifice. Chapter 11 is going to deal with the first two types there. The last one, animals that could be eaten and sacrificed, we talked about that in chapters 1 through 9. So we're going to look at animals that could not be eaten, they were unclean, and animals that could, they were clean. And the reason for the distinction here between clean and unclean animals, it's somewhat unclear. There's been a lot of discussion and commentaries. Even the identity of some of the animals is unclear. There's been a lot of attempts by scholars over the ages to try to interpret what this all means in this kind of catalog, so to speak, of abominable creatures in this book of Leviticus. But there's been some uncertainty as to what it all tied into. There were many other cultures, ancient religions, nations around Israel that observed lists of unclean and clean foods as well. And they all differed from each other, but most likely they all had their origin in this distinction that God had provided going way back to the flood in Genesis 7. And there's at least 6 different explanations for the rationale behind the clean and the unclean distinctions here with these animals. One is that it was just arbitrary. That God simply told the Israelites what to do just to test their obedience. And they had no idea the reasons for what these distinctions were. But the problem with that approach is that it offers no explanation whatsoever that we can understand. So that's one, it's just an arbitrary thing. A second distinction is that it's cultic. That the reason the Israelites were to regard some animals as unclean was that the pagans used them in their worship and associated them with their gods. And so in order to remain faithful to the covenant, they were to avoid those animals. The problem here is there's not much evidence of that. The Israelites may have associated certain unclean animals with pagan practices, but scholars have not been able to explain all the prohibitions just on that basis alone. Another distinction is that it was hygienic. And those who hold this view believe that the unclean animals were unfit to eat because they carried diseases or they were just unhealthy. And that view has gained more popularity, especially recently, as we become more and more concerned about health care and the foods we eat. But the problem here is that the Israelites didn't view these provisions as just being hygienic. A fourth distinction is that this was just symbolical. This view sees the behavior and the habits of the clean animals as just illustrating how the Israelites were to behave, and that the unclean animals represented sinful people. But the problem with this view is that it's very subjective. Seeing symbolic significance in something is a very subjective thing. And the Bible itself doesn't identify that here, which leaves it up to the reader, which presents a problem. So another distinction is that it was just aesthetic. It was just based on the animal's appearance. But again, that's a very subjective distinction. A sixth distinction is that it was ethical. And that's a similar view to the symbolical view that the animals chosen taught reverence for life. But this is, again, highly subjective viewpoint. It's impossible to really prove. Uh, the distinction, um, the seventh, is based on normalcy. And the view here is that God regarded imperfection or abnormality in the animal world as the conditions that rendered it unclean. But this doesn't explain all the cases. One problem with this view is that it runs counter to the fact that after God created the animals in Genesis 1:25, that he created them and declared them to be good. So there's a lot of differences and distinction as to why these regulations were put into place. Some scholars believe it's a combination of them. My interpretation is it seems to be the symbolical explanation that is most likely, that God gave these instructions to the Israelites to teach them about holiness, and that animals that are mentioned here represented or symbolized certain things concerning holiness or unholiness. And because God is holy, because God is separate from all other forms of impurity and commonality, God required that his people would make distinctions that would separate them from unholy things. And this would account for the laws that required separation from anything associated with pagan worship or pagan life or unethical living or sin, because that's what this book is. It's about sin and holiness. So let's look at the distinctions here between the clean and the unclean animals. We'll start in chapter 11 with verse 1. And we see this threefold division of animals: those that inhabit the land, those that inhabit the sea, and those that inhabit the air. And just as in Genesis 1, God distinguished good in his creation, God also identified what was not good. So in Leviticus 11, God is distinguishing here the clean from the unclean. So let's look at first verses 1 through 8, and I'll put these verses up on the screen if you don't have your Bible. And let's just kind of talk about this with all that background in place that I just shared, and let's talk about what this means. So verses 1 through 8. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, remember Aaron is now the high priest, say to the Israelites, of all the animals that live on land. That's the first distinction, right? Land, air, and sea animals. Of all the ones that live on the land, these are the ones that you may eat. You may eat any animal that has a divided hoof and that chews the cud. And we'll talk about this here in just a little bit. There are some that only chew the cud or only have a divided hoof, but you must not eat those. The camel, though it chews the cud, does not have a divided hoof, and so it's ceremonially unclean for you. The hyrax, although it chews the cud, does not have a divided hoof. It is unclean for you. The rabbit, although it chews the cud, does not have a divided hoof. It is unclean for you. And the pig, though it has a divided hoof, it does not chew the cud, and so it is unclean for you. You must not eat their meat or touch their carcasses. They are unclean. So note here that God begins with a positive. He tells the Israelites what they can eat in verses 2 and 3. The animals that have a divided hoof and chew the cud. That was the allowing of what could be eaten. And then God gives a list of the unclean land animals through verses 4 through 8. And, perhaps some of these animals with the cloven hooves were unclean because they only had two digits, so to speak, instead of like five. And maybe therefore they were thought as being abnormal, thus they were unclean. Or maybe their cloven hooves were intended to remind the Israelites of the serpent's cloven tongue. There's some similarities there between the serpent in Eden and his uncleanness, his unholiness, and what God is describing here. Now, this definition of chewing the cud, it's not um, similar to what we define it as today. What the Hebrews considered as chewing the cud is not what we understand. Today, we use this term to describe animals that do not initially chew their food thoroughly and then swallow it, but that they chew it, they swallow it, and then they regurgitate it, and then they chew it again thoroughly, just like cattle do. The animals described here in Leviticus as chewing the cud did not do that. The rabbits don't chew their food, swallow it, regurgitate it, and then chew it again. Camels don't do that, the hyraxes. But these animals do appear to chew their food before swallowing it. So this may be what the Israelites thought of as chewing the cud. Now, any animal that was dead was also unclean because death was not the normal condition of an animal. Remember, we're talking about the uncommon, the unnormal. Death was a result of the fall. Back in Genesis, the fall was the result of sin. And so having contact with any dead thing would remind the people to avoid contacting that thing, that animal carcass, because of sin. So it was a reminder. Sheep and goats and oxen, they were the standard sacrificial animals. They had cloven hooves and they chewed the cud, right? So that's what they had in common. So this is the first distinction, the animals that lived on land, what they were allowed to eat and what they were not allowed to eat. Verses 9 through 12 focuses on the animals of the sea. Verse 9, of all the creatures living in the waters of the seas and the streams, you may eat any that have fins and scales. Again, God starts out with the positive. This is what you are allowed to eat. Anything that has fins and scales. But all the creatures in the streams or in the seas that do not have fins and scales, whether among all the swarming things or among all the other living creatures in the water, you are to regard them as unclean. And since you are to regard them as unclean, you are not to eat their meat. You must regard their carcasses as unclean. Anything living in the water that does not have fins and scales is to be regarded as unclean. And perhaps the Israelites here could eat these creatures that had fins and scales because fins and scales were a normal means of movement, propulsion for these fish, and was normal among the fish. But on the other hand, the basis of this prohibition may have been that these creatures, um, they resembled serpents, so to speak. The ones that were allowed did not. So again, it ties back in to a reminder of sin, to avoid those things that defile and sin. Verses 13 through 19 talks about the birds, or the animals of the air, the birds. Verse 13, these are the birds you are to regard as unclean and not eat because they are unclean. The eagle, the vulture, the black vulture, the red kite, any kind of black kite, any kind of raven, the horned owl, the screech owl, the gull, any kind of hawk, the little owl, the cormorant, the great owl, the white owl, the desert owl, the osprey, the stork, any kind of heron, the hoopoe, and the bat. Now, why these birds? we see a distinction here in these various kinds of birds in these verses. God prohibited 20 different abhorrent varieties, and it was their feeding habits that was the key to their uncleanness. These particular birds ate flesh with blood still in it. The owls, the hawks, the ravens, they were meat eaters, and they would eat other things that had blood still in it, which was something that God had forbidden among his people. And we will see that next week in chapter 17. Blood symbolized life, but it here it's specifically symbolized fallen, sinful life. So it was to be avoided at all costs. It was unclean. And then it shifts the narrative to the insects in verses 20 through 23. And God said to Moses and Aaron, all the flying insects that walk on all fours are to be regarded as unclean. There are, however, some flying insects that walk on all fours that you may eat. Those that have jointed legs for hopping on the ground. Or of these you may eat any kind of locust, or katydid, or cricket, or grasshopper. But all the other flying insects that have 4 legs you are to regard as unclean. And the fact here that certain insects swarmed rather than flew in a more direct, natural way, that's what made them unclean. Their close physical connection with the cursed earth is another possibility that they were unclean. Locusts that hopped were clean, most likely because that was a normal form of motion for them. And so locusts are also less earthbound because of their ability to jump. We know that John the Baptist ate locusts, right, in the wilderness. But there were other varieties of locusts that crawled specifically. They were determined to be unclean. So there was some distinction here, even among the insects, what was allowed to be eaten and what was not. So now let's look at the rest of this chapter, and we'll look at the pollution by the animals and the treatment for this. And the rest of this chapter addresses questions that arise from human contact with unclean animals. And only the dead animals here is what polluted human beings. No living unclean animal polluted. It was only the dead animals that polluted. And we'll see that in verses 24, 27, 31, and 39. Death is an abnormal condition. It came as a result of sin, and it causes defilement, pollution, contamination, uncleanness. And that's what we're going to see here in the rest of this chapter. Death has this kind of a direct connection with sin. So verse 24, let's go through verse 28. You will make yourselves unclean by these. Whoever touches their carcasses will be unclean until evening. Remember at the very beginning of the study tonight, I had shared there were different timelines based on what had happened. So this touching a carcass would leave you unclean to the evening. Whoever picks up a carcass must wash their clothes. They will be unclean until evening. Every animal that does not have a divided hoof or does not chew the cud is unclean. That's a repetition of what we talked about in the first part of the chapter. Whoever touches the carcass of any of them will be unclean. Of all the animals that walk on all fours, those that walk on their paws, they are unclean. Whoever touches their carcass will be unclean until the evening. Anyone who picks up their carcass must wash their clothes, and they will be unclean until evening. These animals are unclean for you. In these verses, Moses, from God, is passing along more specific directions concerning defilement from animal carcasses. Now, walking on paws for animals which look like hands, right, a dog paw or a cat, this appears unnatural. This may have been the reason why land animals that move on paws were considered to be unclean. And it was an abnormality to see something walking around on its hands, so to speak. These animals had a closer connection to the ground. And the ground, remember, as God sent Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden, he said, "Cursed be the ground, cursed be the earth." And these kinds of animals with their hand-like paws were close to that. It was defilement to touch them. Verses 29 through 32. Of the animals that move along the ground, these are the ones that are unclean for you. And now we get this list of unclean animals: the weasel, the rat, any kind of great lizard, the gecko, the monitor, the wall lizard, the skink, the chameleon. Of all those that move along the ground, these are all unclean for you. Whoever touches them when they are dead will be unclean until the evening. When one of them dies and falls on something, that article, whatever its use, will be unclean. Whether it is made of wood, cloth, hide, or sackcloth, put it in water. It will be unclean until the evening, and then it will be clean. These verses deal with creatures and the contamination that they may create. Some of these were swarming creatures, and they were regarded as being chaotic in their motion. It wasn't a natural motion. They swarmed, and it was in large groups. They slithered on the ground. They scurried on the land. Another reminder of the serpent from the Garden of Eden. Normal movement would have been an orderly walking progress. These particular animals, none of them did that. And anything which any of these animals or insects that touched or that landed on became contaminated. Those objects, the water would cleanse and then could be reused. But those that the water could not cleanse, such as an earthenware vessel, that could not be reused and had to be destroyed. So very particular, distinct rules and regulations here regarding these land animals. Verses 33 through 38. If one of them falls into a clay pot, everything in it will be unclean. You must break the pot. Any food that you are allowed to eat that has come into contact with water from any such pot is unclean. And any liquid that is drunk from such a pot is unclean. Anything that one of their carcasses falls on and becomes unclean, an oven or a cooking pot, must be broken up. They are unclean. You are to regard them as unclean. A spring, however, or a cistern for collecting water, that remains clean. But anyone who touches one of these carcasses is unclean. If a carcass falls on any seeds that are to be planted, they remain clean. But if water has been put on the seed and a carcass falls on that, that is unclean for you. A lot in there. Earthenware vessels. They were contaminated. Why? Because they were made out of the earth. It's an earthenware vessel. And the earth, again, was cursed. So that's why they were contaminated. And that's why they were to be broken, these pots. If one of these creatures fell or landed in a cistern or a spring, we see here an exception was made. Neither the container nor the water would become impure. Only the person who fished that dead animal out would be considered unclean. And, God may have granted this exception here, declaring that these large water supplies were not necessarily unclean, because doing so, declaring a cistern as unclean, would have had serious consequences for the Israelites in this dry, barren desert where they lived, where water was, precious to them. So declaring a whole cistern as unclean would have had some devastating effects on the Israelites. And there was also a distinction made here between seed for sowing, which was clean, and seed for eating, which was pronounced contaminated. So distinctions there too in the type of seed. Verses 39 through 43. If an animal that you are allowed to eat dies, anyone who touches its carcass will be unclean until evening. Anyone who eats some of that carcass must wash their clothes, and they will be unclean until the evening. Anyone who picks up the carcass must wash their clothes. They will be unclean until the evening. God is giving further instructions here, directions about the contaminating effects of even clean animals that died. Verses 39 and 40. Every creature that moves along the ground is to be regarded as unclean. It is not to be eaten. You are not to eat any creature that moves along the ground, whether it moves on its belly or walks on all fours or on many feet. It is unclean. Do not defile yourselves by any of these creatures. Do not make yourselves unclean by any means of them, or be made unclean by them. Verse 44, I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy. Do not make yourselves unclean by any creature that moves along the ground. I am the Lord who brought you up out of Egypt to be your God. Therefore be holy, because I am holy. God called on his people here to be holy because he is holy. And these are perhaps the key verses to this whole book. Our highest duty is to imitate our Creator by being as he is. And this statement by God that I am the Lord, this occurs 46 times throughout Leviticus. It identifies Israel's God as the ever-living, ever-present God in every aspect of daily life was affected by the reality of the presence of God. Be holy as I am holy. In verse 46, these are the regulations concerning the animals, the birds, every living thing that moves around in the water, every creature that moves on the ground. You must distinguish between the unclean and the clean, between living creatures that may be eaten and those that may not. This final summary here states the purpose of these laws: to make a distinction between the unclean, the sinful, and the clean, the holy, between the edible and the unedible, to make a distinction between that which God declares to be holy and that which God declares to be not holy. And the Israelites here, the purpose here is that they could never gaze on these creatures merely with the feelings of thinking, well, I admire God. God created this creature. They were now being led to think of these creatures as being connected to a holy God. They were to look at this completely different to the eyes of God through holiness, to be holy like I am holy. Now, these were the laws for the Israelites. The New Testament teaches us that these Old Testament laws are no longer binding for the Christian. These laws symbolize God's choice of Israel. They served as constant reminders of God's grace in choosing them as his people. Those who have been redeemed by the holy sovereign God must demonstrate holiness in their everyday lives. That's what happened through Christ, his death and resurrection. It doesn't lie in our eating, it lies in our living. And so these are the laws for the Israelites. We live under Christ's law concerning these things. So I know that's a lot. It's going to be a lot the rest of the week. So take time, go back and reread, go back and rewatch the video, look at different commentaries. and it'll become easier to understand. Tomorrow we're going to look at chapter 12 and uncleanness as it relates to childbirth. So thank you for being here this evening. I pray that you have a wonderful night. Stay well, stay healthy. Try not to get too overwhelmed by this, but go back and reread it again, and we'll keep talking about it this week. But thanks for being here. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Until then, take care, and God bless. Bye-bye.